somewhere beneath a quiet field in southern England, there are tunnels. Not deep in the way a subway is deep, far enough underground that the air changes, that the sound of the surface disappears, that you'd need a light to see your hands in front of your face. The tunnels are old, very old, and the thing that makes them strange isn't their depth or their length. It's the fact that the people who dug them didn't have metal tools, didn't have writing, didn't have cities or governments or engineers with blueprints rolled under their arms. They had stone picks, antler bones, fire, and each other. And they went underground anyway. That's the question that quietly pulls at you when you start looking into prehistoric mining. Not a screaming mystery, not a conspiracy, just a gentle, persistent question that sits at the back of your mind. Why? Why would people who were working so hard, just to eat, just to stay warm, just to survive another winter, why would they spend enormous energy digging tunnels into the earth? What were they after? And how did they know it was down there in the first place? This video is going to try to answer that question slowly and carefully, the way a good night's reading does. Evidence first. No ancient aliens, no lost civilizations with forgotten technology. What we actually find underground is more interesting than any of that, because it's human, completely, recognizably, almost startlingly human. These are the fingerprints of people who thought carefully about what they needed, organized themselves to go get it, and left behind traces we're still learning to read. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's genuinely why I make these. So, subscribe if you feel like it, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I read them, and it's always a little remarkable. Someone in Auckland at 2 a.m, someone in Edinburgh at 10:30 at night, someone on a train somewhere in Japan. All of you in different darkness, which is a strangely comforting thing to think about. Now, back underground, materials that drew people down into the earth are, on the surface, pretty ordinary. Flint, ochre, salt, copper, certain kinds of stone, soot. None of these sound like reasons to risk your life in a tunnel. But when you understand what each of those materials meant to a prehistoric community, when you understand that flint was the difference between a sharp edge and no edge at all, tossed, that ochre was used in burial ceremonies and body paint, and possibly in some of the oldest symbolic art we've ever found, that salt preserved food through winters that would otherwise kill you, that copper opened up an entirely new way of making tools and weapons, and objects of status and beauty. Suddenly the risk makes more sense. Suddenly the effort makes sense. Suddenly the tunnels make sense. What we're going to find, as we go through the evidence site by site and period by period, is that organised underground mining didn't require anything we'd recognise as advanced civilization. It required something older than civilization, required skill, community, accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next, an understanding of geology that nobody wrote down but everybody carried in their heads. The ability to look at a hillside or a chalk plain and think, something useful below this, and I know how to get to it, and I know how to get to it. That's not a lost technology. That's not evidence of visitors from somewhere else. That's just people being people, which is honestly more impressive when you let it sink in properly. Title of this video uses the phrase shouldn't exist, and I want to be clear about what I mean by that, because it matters. I don't mean these mines are impossible or inexplicable. I mean they're surprising. I mean that most of us walk through the world with a rough mental map of human history, where people in the deep past were surviving, scattered, proliferate, and fairly simple in their material needs. And then you find out there are shaft mines in Belgium that are 6,000 years old. That there's evidence of organised ochre extraction in southern Africa that might go back 300,000 years. And that picture of the simple past gets quietly more complicated. The surprise isn't that something impossible happened. It's that what actually happened is more organised, more deliberate, and more deeply human than we expected. So that's where we're going tonight, but we're going to start at the very beginning of the archaeological story. Before any specific site, just think about what deep time digging actually means. Then we're going to walk through some of the most remarkable prehistoric mines ever found, the chalk mines of Norfolk. Of Belgium, an ochre cave in Eswatini that may be one of the oldest industrial sites on Earth, salt workings. Early copper, stone quarried and carried across distances that should have been impossible without wheels or roads, all of it connected by a single quiet thread. People who needed something the Earth was holding on to, and who found a way, slowly, carefully, together, to go down and bring it back up. Let's start in the dark. The word prehistoric gets used so casually that it's easy to forget what it actually means. It doesn't mean primitive. It doesn't mean simple. It means before writing, before the point where human beings started leaving records of their own actions in a form we can read. And that's a much longer stretch of time than most people carry around in their heads. Agriculture is maybe 10,000 years old. Writing is maybe 5,000 years old. Modern humans have been around for something like 300,000 years, which means that for the overwhelming majority of human existence, people were solving hard problems, making decisions, organising communities, developing knowledge. And none of it was written down. All of it had to survive by other means. This is what makes underground sites so valuable to archaeologists. Not just the objects found inside them, but the fact that underground environments preserve things that the surface destroys. Campfire in a field leaves almost nothing after 1,000 years. A campfire at the back of a mine shaft can leave charred wood, soot marks, residue on the walls. A footprint in open soil is gone in a season. A footprint pressed into the clay floor of a sealed tunnel can last millennia. The earth itself becomes a kind of slow archive. Not a perfect one, not a complete one, but one that rewards very careful reading. Survives underground tends to be specific. Tool marks cut into rock faces, antler picks left where they were dropped, or wedged into crevices when their tines broke. Spoil heaps, piles of waste material, carried out of a shaft and dumped at the entrance. That tell you roughly how much rock was removed, and in what sequence. Lamp hollows scooped into ledges, sometimes still containing traces of the fat or oil that was burned for light, pigments that were ground or stored at the site, and occasionally preserved organic material, fragments of rope, wooden wedges, charcoal from fires that were used both for warmth and for a technique we'll come back to later, a way of weakening rock with heat before striking it. Each of these things is a kind of fingerprint, not of an individual necessarily, but of a practice, of people who had worked out, through accumulated experience passed from one generation to the next, how to do a particular job in a particular kind of rock. Remarkable thing, when you sit with it quietly, is how much problem-solving is embedded in those traces. Every one of those objects or marks represents a decision someone made about how to do something difficult. Start with the most basic constraints, the ones that shaped every underground excavation from the earliest ochre pit to the deepest copper shaft. Light, air, water, and the ever-present possibility of the ceiling coming down. Light underground is essentially nothing. Even on a bright day, natural light fails almost immediately once you move away from an entrance. Anyone working more than a few meters into a mine needed an artificial light source, which meant fat or oil in some kind of hollow container, or a resin torch, or fire. These things produce smoke. Smoke underground builds up fast, especially in a sealed tunnel, which means the shape of a mine isn't just about following a seam of material. It's also about managing airflow. You need some way for fresh air to come in and stale air and smoke to escape. This is one reason why many prehistoric mines have multiple shafts that connect at depth. It looks, to a modern eye, like planned engineering, and in a sense it is. But it's planning that emerges incrementally from practical necessity. You dig until the air gets bad, then you find another way in, or up, or across. Air and light together push tunnels towards certain shapes, low and wide, allows more face for work, with less overhead rock to worry about, short vertical shafts, with horizontal galleries branching from them, keep the smoke moving, galleries that connect underground, can create the kind of draft that makes the air breathable for hours instead of minutes. None of this requires a blueprint, experience. It requires someone who has been underground before, who knows what it feels like when the air starts to go bad, and who knows from memory and from what they were taught what to do about it. Water is a different problem. In chalk geology, which is where some of the most remarkable British prehistoric mines are found, groundwater tends to sit at predictable depths, and miners could go quite deep before hitting it. In other kinds of rock, water comes in unpredictably, through fractures, pooling in low spots, making floors slippery and walls unstable. Evidence from some sites suggests that prehistoric miners dug drainage channels, redirected water flow, chose their shafts carefully to avoid the worst of it. Again, not the result of formal engineering, result of paying close attention to the rock over a very long time. This is the one that carries the most weight, literally, and in terms of what it tells us about the people who worked underground. Rock falls happen. They happen to prehistoric miners. Of course, we have skeletal evidence from at least one site suggesting that accidents occurred and that the bodies of those who died underground were sometimes retrieved and buried, which is a quietly remarkable thing to think about. People going back into a collapsed tunnel, not to salvage tools, but to recover the dead. The response to collapse shapes tunnel design in visible ways. Miners in chalk, for instance, tended to leave pillars of unexcavated material standing at intervals to support the ceiling. From above, on a plan, this looks deliberate, architectural even. And it is deliberate. But it's a kind of deliberateness that grows from close observation of how chalk behaves when you take much of it away too quickly. The miners learned, probably through painful experience, where the limits were. Pillars are the physical record of that learning. This brings us to something that trips up a lot of popular accounts of prehistoric mining, looking at the branching galleries of a site like Grimes Graves or the Spiennes Flint mines in Belgium. It's tempting to see a planned network, to imagine someone drawing it out in advance, deciding where each tunnel would go. But the archaeological evidence generally tells a more incremental story. Tunnels branch because miners were following seams. The best flint, the most workable layer, the vein of ochre, with the richest colour, it doesn't run straight. It curves, it thins, it splits, it dips. Miner, following good material, through indifferent rock, is not executing a plan so much as reading the earth continuously and adjusting. The network that results can look, in retrospect, remarkably organised. And it is organised. It's organised by the logic of the material itself, by the accumulated judgment of people who had been paying very close attention for a very long time. What looks like architecture is often just deep literacy. Literacy in stone, in chalk, in the colour and texture and smell of rock that contains what you're after versus rock that doesn't. Which brings us to the question that runs underneath all of this. The one that will keep surfacing as we go through specific sites. What need was strong enough to justify all of this? Because underground work is not casual. It's not something you stumble into. It requires preparation. Tools made before you go down. Light sources prepared and carried in. Some kind of system for getting excavated material back up to the surface. And people willing to spend long periods in the dark, in the cold, in air that gets worse the deeper you go, doing physically demanding work under conditions where a mistake in reading the rock could end everything. This is not the behaviour of people with a lot of spare time. This is deliberate, costly, organised effort, which means the materials being extracted had to be worth it. Genuinely worth it, in ways that affected survival or ceremony, or the ability to trade for other things that affected survival. The threshold for going underground, for building and maintaining the knowledge base required to do it safely, was high. Whatever pushed people past that threshold was serious. Flint meant tools. Tools meant food, defence, fire. Ochre meant ceremony, preservation, identity. Salt meant the ability to keep food through winter. Copper eventually meant a new category of object entirely. Each of these materials had a weight of necessity behind it that, when you understand it properly, makes the tunnels feel less mysterious and more logical. The surprise isn't that people dug for them. The surprise is how far back that impulse goes, and how sophisticated the knowledge required to do it safely really was. Keep that question in your mind as we go forward. Not as something unsettling, but as something worth following quietly through the dark. What were they after? How did they know it was there? And what did they understand about the earth under their feet that let them go down after it, come back up again? The answers are in the rock. They're in the marks and the spoil and the broken antler picks left behind. They're in what the miners knew and how they learned it. Let's go find them. When archaeologists walk up to an ancient mine, they don't see a hole in the ground. They see a text. Not a neat linear one. More like a palimpsest, layer written over layer, whole passages erased by erosion, roots, modern quarrying. Reading it takes a set of tools just as specialised as the antler picks and stone, hammers that made it. One of the first questions is deceptively simple. When? When was this being used? Because old isn't precise enough. Flint mine worked in the early Neolithic might look very similar in basic form to one used 2,000 years later. To separate those stories, archaeologists lean on anything that ties human activity to a clock. In a mining context, that clock is often organic. Antler picks are a gift in this sense. Antler is bone. Bone contains collagen. Collagen contains carbon. If even a fraction of that protein survives, it can be dated using radiocarbon. The same goes for wooden shovels, brushwood laid down on muddy floors, torches or charcoal from lamps and fires. Take a tiny sample. Measure how much radiocarbon remains. and you get a time window for when that animal was alive, and, by reasonable extension, when its antlers were being swung against chalk in the dark. But organic material isn't always present, or it can be disturbed, spoil heaps. The mounds of discarded rock and earth outside a mine become another kind of clock. As miners dig down, they pile distant material up, time. These heaps build in layers. The earliest workings are buried under later dumps. If a later community builds a hearth on top of an old spoil heap or buries someone there, that feature can be dated, giving a no later than boundary for the mining below it. Stratigraphy, the reading of layers that archaeologists use at open-air sites, still applies here. Only the layers are piles of chalk rubble and flint nodules instead of river silts. Some tunnels give up yet another timekeeper, trapped electrons. When certain minerals are buried away from sunlight, natural background radiation slowly fills imperfections in their crystal structure with energy. Techniques, like optically stimulated luminescence or thermoluminescence, can measure that stored energy, reset the clock. When a grain of quartz was last exposed to light or heated strongly, and suddenly you have an age estimate for when sediment filled a shaft, or when a clay lamp was fired. It isn't as precise as radiocarbon, and it comes with wide error bars, but combined with other evidence, it helps tighten the picture. Layered over all of this are typologies, quiet comparative work of saying, this kind of tool belongs more often to this period than to that one. The shape of a flint pick, the way a shaft lining is constructed, the style of pottery used by miners at the surface village. These can be matched against better dated sites. Typology doesn't stand on its own. It's a supporting argument. But when the same tool forms appear again and again at sites with good radiocarbon dates, they become another strand in the weave of time. Once a rough when has been secured, the questions turn to what and how. Identifying what was being taken isn't always obvious. In Flint mines, it can be, the face of the gallery. Hugs a particular chalk layer that contains dark, glassy nodules. Psst. You can literally see where the miners stopped when the good material ran out. In ochre workings, the walls are stained red or yellow, the floor is dusted with iron-rich powder. In salt mines, the rock itself tastes of it, and the walls show the crystalline shimmer of halite. These are the easy cases. Sometimes the evidence is more fine-grained. Tools recovered from underground sites carry residues, microscopic traces of what they were used on. Under a microscope or with chemical analysis, you can see thin films of iron oxide or salt crystals embedded along a working edge, or the distinct polish that comes from repeatedly scraping a particular mineral. Microwear analysis looks at these patterns of polish, striations, and edge rounding. To distinguish, say, flint edge used to cut wood from one used to chip chalk or work hide. Even without the material itself, the geometry of the void can tell you what was being pursued. Miners, following a flint seam, don't dig straight lines. They snake along a horizon, ducking and widening where the layer thickens, narrowing where it thins. Copper ore bodies, in contrast, may produce irregular pockets and vertical chimneys where veins run up and down, not sideways. Each target leaves its own characteristic network of galleries. Over time, archaeologists learn to recognize those patterns, just as miners once learned to recognize the faint color changes or textures that whispered here versus there. From here, reading shifts from object to action. How many people were working here? How skilled were they? What did a day underground actually look like? One line of evidence is in the walls themselves. Tightly spaced, parallel pick marks, all at roughly the same angle, suggest methodical, repeated blows by practiced hands. Where different angles overlap, you may be seeing the work of different individuals at different times, or hasty, less controlled efforts. In some mines you can trace a sequence: coarse, heavy blows opening a gallery, then finer finishing work, smoothing out the ceiling or floor. That division hints at task specialization, or at least an understanding of stages in the process. Standardized shaft diameters also speak volumes. When dozens or hundreds of vertical shafts in a mining field cluster around the same width, it's unlikely to be chance. Certain diameter seems to represent the compromise point, wide enough for a person to descend and for baskets of spoil to be raised, narrow enough to minimize the volume of rock that must be removed and to keep the roof stable. Finding that balance isn't trivial. Stumbling on it once is luck. Repeating it over an entire landscape is knowledge. Evidence of repair and reuse reinforces this impression of learning over time. In some prehistoric mines, earlier, narrower galleries have been widened, their ceilings raised with care, their pillars reshaped. Crude early supports are replaced with stronger ones. Collapsed zones are shored up and bypassed. You can almost feel the conversations across generations encoded in those changes. This part failed. Don't do it like that again. Do it like this. Beyond the individual worker or crew, the mine itself sometimes reveals traces of how a community organized the underground space. Access routes show up as trampled paths, worn steps cut into the sides of shafts, or ramps carefully graded to make hauling easier. In complex sites, there are often clear divisions between areas where people worked the face of the mineral and areas where they sorted stone, napped flakes, piled waste. Floors get cleaner or dirtier depending on function. Hearths cluster where people paused to rest, warm themselves, or maintain lamps. Waste management leaves its own distinct signature. Spoil isn't simply dumped randomly when effort is precious. At many sites, heaps are neatly banked away from entrances, or used to build platforms and windbreaks. In underground chambers, exhausted chalk or rock is stacked deliberately along walls, sometimes even used to reinforce them. This suggests not only practical efficiency, but an awareness that space underground is limited and must be managed. Ventilation strategies can also be inferred. Multiple shafts connecting to the same gallery create pressure differences that move air. In some mines, archaeologists have found small, seemingly purposeless shafts that don't line up with major working areas, but do open into roof spaces or dead-end pockets. One interpretation is that these are air holes, dug to improve circulation in otherwise stagnant galleries. We can't watch the smoke move, but the configuration of voids makes certain air patterns more likely than others. Taken together, these traces imply some degree of planning, however incremental. Someone decided where the next shaft should go relative to the last. Someone understood which galleries should connect and which should remain separate. Someone, or more likely several someones over time, held a mental map of the mine that went beyond their own headlamp circle of light. And yet, for all this detail, there are things the rock refuses to tell us. We can infer that work was organised. We can't see the conversations that shaped that organisation. Was there a designated leader directing labour? Was authority inherited, earned, or rotating? The archaeology is mostly silent. Particularly rich galleries might imply control by a certain family or lineage, burial near a shaft might suggest someone important died underground. But these are possibilities, not certainties. We can see that ochre or flint or salt was worth serious effort. We can't read with confidence the inner meanings those materials carried. Was red ochre primarily practical, used to preserve hides and protect skin from the sun? Was it also ceremonial, tied to ideas of blood, life, death? Both seem likely in many contexts. But the mine itself rarely settles the question. Even motivation at the simplest level is layered. Community may have dug to secure a resource for survival, to acquire a material that signalled status, to fulfill obligations in a trade network, or to supply pigments or stones for rituals that made sense only within their worldview. Those reasons can coexist. Tunnels don't tell us which one dominated on any given day. This is the balance that careful archaeology tries to keep, reading as much as the evidence will bear, tool marks, spoil, residues, shafts, galleries, without letting the silence between those lines tempt us into stories that feel good but aren't grounded. Mines we'll visit in the next sections do sometimes seem, at first glance, too complex, too extensive to fit our casual picture of prehistoric people. But when you look closely, with this toolkit in mind, the mystery changes shape. Question is no longer, how could they possibly have done this? But what long chain of observations and decisions led them, step by step, to this depth? To explore that, we need to look at the tools themselves, and the techniques that turned stubborn rock into workable material. Antler, stone, and fire, wielded with patience, will take us further underground. If you picture a mine, you might imagine iron drills, steel picks, maybe even dynamite. Strip all of that away. Go back before metal, before written plans, before anyone was drawing cross-sections of tunnels on clay tablets. What you're left with looks deceptively modest. Stone hammers, antler picks, wooden wedges, baskets and hides. In many prehistoric mines, the most common tool is simply a rounded cobble that fits well in the hand, hammerstone. Picked from a riverbed or a scree slope because it's tough, fine-grained, and doesn't shatter too easily. These stones rarely look dramatic in a museum case. Often they're just oblong rocks with one end battered flat and pitted from repeated blows. But in the dark, they were the first line of attack against the rock face, where the hammerstone wasn't enough on its own. People brought in organic tools. Red deer antler, for instance, is remarkably strong and slightly flexible. Fashioned into picks and chisels, antler could bite into softer rocks like chalk or certain ores, without sparking and without fracturing as easily as stone. Bone, too, could be trimmed to a point and used to probe cracks, lever out nodules, or rake loose debris from tight spaces of host. Archaeologists find these tools underground, their tips worn shiny, their shafts stained with minerals, sometimes broken at the point of maximum stress, where someone hit just a little too hard. Wood filled in the gaps. Wooden wedges were driven into natural fractures with those same hammerstones, soaked to swell, and left to exert steady pressure. Tough roots or saplings could be trimmed into pry bars. Simple handles, lashed to stone or antler heads, gave extra leverage and control. Almost none of this wood survives in open-air sites, but in constantly cool, damp mine environments, or in salt, some fragments have endured. They show smoothing from repeated grip, polish where they slid against rock, traces of the thousands of hands that used them. Once rock was freed, it had to be moved. Here the toolkit shifts from cutting to carrying. Baskets woven from plant fibres, tough enough to hold broken chalk or ore fragments. Hides or leather sheets used as slings and drag mats, piling spoil on and hauling it toward the shaft. The archaeology here is subtler. The baskets themselves decay, but impressions of their weaving patterns sometimes remain in compacted spoil. Wear patterns on shaft lips suggest ropes, straps, and containers being pulled up and over. Again and again, year after year. Alongside these quiet tools sits one technique that feels almost violent by comparison: fire setting. Fire setting is simple in principle and demanding in practice. You build a fire against a rock face, let it burn hot, then quench the heated stone with water or expose it to cooler air. The sudden temperature change makes the outer layers crack and spall, weakening the rock so it can be broken away with much less effort from hammers and picks. Pust. This method is known historically from Bronze Age and classical mines. But there are good arguments that it goes back much further, at least to the Neolithic in some regions and possibly earlier. Archaeologically, you don't usually see great blackened caverns. Instead, you find thin lenses of charcoal and ash directly against a wall, reddened or crazed surfaces on the rock, micro-cracks beneath the outer layer. In some copper mines, there are distinct bands. A layer of soot and charcoal, then debris from broken rock, then another soot layer. Fire, break, clear. Fire, break, clear. A cycle repeated in the same small space over long periods. Working with open flame underground is not trivial. Fire eats oxygen and produces smoke. That meant fire setting probably happened in short bursts in areas with some natural airflow or near connection points to other shafts where smoke could escape. It also meant that, alongside the big fires, miners needed smaller, controllable lights. Before candles, before electric lamps, a mine was lit by things that burned fat and fibre, small lamps carved from stone or made from clay, holding lumps of animal fat or plant oils, with twisted plant fibres or strips of moss as wicks, simple torches. Sticks wrapped in resinous wood, bark, or dry grasses, maybe dipped in fat. These left their own quiet signatures. Soot accumulates where flame licks the ceiling over and over, making dark patches above work areas. The highest soot stains in some tunnels show the maximum standing height of ancient miners. As clearly as a photograph, the distribution of soot tells a story about rhythm. Thick, localized blackening near the working face suggests repeated, concentrated activity. Many short sessions rather than one long, smoky ordeal. Thin streaks along access routes, heavier deposits in chambers where people paused, perhaps to rest or repair tools. Underground, light would have been precious. A torch burns down, oil runs low. Each flare of flame measures an interval of work, a small pocket of labour between darkness and darkness. With limited light and no written plans, the engineering that kept these spaces open had to be learned hands. Yet even in some of the earliest mines, clear evidence of structural thinking. Miners often left pillars of unworked material to support roofs. In chalk mines, pillars can be surprisingly regular, spaced in patterns that distribute the load. Where rock was less stable, people brought the surface underground. Wooden props wedged under weak ceilings, stacked stone walls reinforcing the edges of galleries. You can see sequences where a roof has started to crack, and someone has responded by adding supports or abandoning that route and opening a new passage along a safer line. Collapses, too, become part of the archaeological record. Fallen slabs, crushed tools, sudden interruptions in a gallery's progress all point to episodes where the rock won. From the pattern of later workings, you can infer that people learned from these failures. Dangerous zones are avoided in subsequent generations. New shafts are sunk at safer angles. Pillars get thicker in areas with a history of instability. No one had trigonometry. What they had was memory, experience, the human tendency to tell others where it isn't safe to go. All of this raises a quiet but important point. The tools themselves are simple by our standards. No alloys, no gears, no pulleys in the early phases. But simple does not mean weak. It certainly doesn't mean stupid. Given enough time, enough hands, and enough shared knowledge, hammerstones and antler picks can open elaborate underground networks. Think about the timescale, where many prehistoric mines weren't dug out in a decade and then abandoned. They were revisited over centuries, sometimes millennia. Each generation added a little more. Another shaft here, a widened gallery there, a side chamber, chasing a promising vein, children, who once carried baskets at the surface, grew up to swing picks at the face, bringing with them everything they had seen and heard from elders. From above, in our compressed view, these networks can look like the product of a single, coordinated project. In reality, they are often tapestries woven slowly, line by line. The continuity lies not in any central plan, but in the tools and techniques that were stable enough to be taught and retaught. How to strike with stone without shattering it. How to read a seam. How far you can trust a chalk roof before you leave another pillar. As we move on to look at flint mining on a larger scale, it helps to keep this in mind. The industry we're about to see is built from these quiet elements. Stone, antler, fire, wood, patient accumulation of experience in the dark. Flint, for many of these miners, was not just another stone. It was the edge on almost everything that cut, pierced, shaved, or scraped in daily life. Take a nodule of good flint, strike it at the right angle, and it does something special. Instead of crumbling, it breaks along smooth, curved surfaces, giving you razor-sharp flakes with predictable shapes. The fracture is conchoidal, like broken glass. With practice, you can control the way those flakes come off, turning a rounded pebble into a knife, spear point, a drill, or a scraper, with just a few carefully placed blows. In a world without metal blades, that matters. Every hide that needs to be skinned, every carcass that needs to be butchered, every wooden shaft that needs trimming depends on edges as sharp as you can make them. Teeth and fingernails are not enough. Bone and woodwork, but they dull quickly. Good flint, worked well, can be sharper at the microscopic scale than many modern steel blades. So when a community found a place where high-quality flint lay thick in the ground, it wasn't just discovering a set of rocks. It was finding the bedrock of its tool economy. On the surface, flint often appears as scattered nodules in ploughed fields, eroding from hillsides, or lodged in chalk outcrops. Those loose pieces were probably used first, but loose pieces run out, or they're too small, or flawed inside. At some point, people realized that far below their feet, in the chalk itself, there were entire bands of flint nodules, layer after layer, extending over wide areas. That realization marks a quiet turning point. Instead of simply gathering what erosion offers, people started going down to meet the stone where it rested. Flint mining in chalk doesn't look like a single grand tunnel. It looks like a landscape of holes. Across certain plateaus, you get dense fields of shafts, circular or oval pits sunk straight through the soil and into the white chalk beneath. From the air, or on a map, they form clusters, rows, sometimes almost grid-like patterns. Underground, each shaft opens into one or more low galleries radiating outward along the flint layer, following the seam horizontally. The miners weren't chasing a random vein. They already knew exactly which horizon held the best nodules. That knowledge came from earlier probes, test pits, perhaps natural exposures at valley edges. Once the right depth was understood, later shafts tend to be remarkably consistent. Similar diameters, similar depths, similar ways of branching out at the base. You can see that standardization in the archaeological record. One shaft is much like another a few meters away. Galleries curl along the same layer, turn back before hitting the neighbouring workings, leaving thin chalk walls as boundaries. It suggests not just individual skill, but shared rules. A community mental model of how a flint mine should be laid out. Inside those galleries, the work was focused and repetitive. Chalk is soft enough to cut with antler and bone picks, so miners undercut around each flint nodule, freeing it from its white casing. The edges of the galleries often have smooth, scooped profiles where tools repeatedly carved the same arcs. Piles of chalk debris line the floors. In places you can still see negative impressions where nodules were pried out and carried away. The surface. All that chalk had to go somewhere. Around mining zones, you often find heaps and rings of white spoil forming low banks and mounds. Time they slump and weather, but their pattern remains. A textured skin over the landscape, made of rock that has been dug up, broken, carried, dumped. From a distance, such areas start to look like the ghosts of later industrial districts. Not smokestacks and factories, but a pitted, work terrain. A place where the ground itself has been reorganized around a single resource. The regularity of the shafts, repeated layouts of galleries, point toward something else as well. Specialization. Not every person in a community needed to know how to sink a shaft safely, or how to follow a seam without breaking through into an older working. Consistent designs suggest that some individuals or groups became experts in this underground craft. Generation after generation, they learned where to place support pillars, how wide a gallery could be before the chalk started to fail, how to listen for subtle changes in sound as they struck the walls. Archaeologists sometimes find clusters of unfinished tools and flakes in particular zones, signs of working floors where certain tasks were concentrated. Inside the mines, close to where nodules were freed, you often find the earliest stages of tool production. Rough out. Flint is heavy, and raw nodules can include flaws, cracks, thick cortex you don't want to haul across long distances. So miners and knappers began the first shaping steps, right at the source. They knocked off the outer rind, split nodules along natural lines, removed obvious imperfections, perhaps started the basic forms of blades or cores. By the time the stone left the immediate mining area, it had already been transformed. We could call it preforms, or roux-outs, pieces still needing fine retouch, but lightened, standardized, ready for finishing closer to where they would be used. This step links the mine to a broader landscape of workshops and camps around major flint sources. Archaeologists find halos of debris. Those zones where more advanced knapping took place, people sat and worked flakes into final tools, leaving dense carpets of sharp offcuts. Further out still, in villages, or temporary hunting camps, dozens or hundreds of kilometres away, you find finished blades, arrowheads, scrapers, some made from local stone, others from flint that is geologically foreign to that region. That foreign flint is a crucial clue. High-quality stone has a geological accent. Its colour, translucency, impurity bands, microstructure can often be tied back to specific formations. When the same distinctive flint shows up far from its source, tells us that stone was moving through networks of exchange. People were not only mining flint for themselves. They were obtaining it from others, giving it away, trading it, perhaps presenting it as gifts in rituals or alliances. A core of fine, glossy black flint from a famous quarry might carry social meaning as well as practical value. Owning tools made from such stone could mark you as connected to powerful neighbours, or as part of a group with access to prestigious resources. In this way, flint mining helped create some of the first industrial landscapes on Earth. Not in the sense of smoke and machinery, but in the sense of places reshaped by repeated, specialised work, linked into wider systems of production and distribution. Underground, miners worked in chalk and darkness, freeing nodules one by one. On the surface, others turned those nodules into blades and points. Beyond the horizon, people carried and exchanged them, stitching together distant communities with lines of stone. And in a few places, these patterns become especially clear, preserved like a frozen snapshot of Neolithic industry. One of those places lies in eastern England, where a quiet plateau of chalk hides a honeycomb of ancient shafts and galleries. To understand just how elaborate flint mining could become, we can walk in imagination into the chalk mines of Grimes Graves. Grimes Graves is an odd name for a place that has no graves and nothing to do with anyone called Grimes. What it does have is holes, hundreds of them. Across a patch of Norfolk chalkland, shallow grass and heather hide a field of circular depressions. To walk there today is to move through a kind of softened lunar landscape, each hollow marking the mouth of a Neolithic shaft that once opened into darkness. Host. When archaeologists began excavating those hollows in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found something far more intricate than simple pits. Beneath each depression, the chalk had been pierced by a shaft, many of them 10 to 12 metres deep, some even more. At the bottom, the miners had widened out their working space into low chambers and radiating galleries, following the best flint band as it curved through the chalk. Seen in section, single mine looks almost like a white stem, with a dark flower, a narrow vertical throat opening onto petals of low tunnels, spreading sideways along, single horizon. Seen as a whole landscape, Grimes Graves is a dense cluster of those stems, interlocking but rarely breaking into one another. Each shaft is a separate descent, punched down to the same prized layer. The methods behind this are written into the chalk itself. In many galleries, the walls and ceilings still show the scars of antler picks. The chalk surface carries parallel grooves and scooped hollows where tools were swung, again and again along the same arcs. Loose antler tines lie where they were dropped or discarded, their tips blunted and polished by impact. These weren't casual digging sticks. Red deer antler makes a tough, springy pick that bites into soft rock. At Grimes Graves, miners shaped tines into curved picks and straight points, sometimes mounting them on wooden handles. Over time, the impact of thousands of blows left a distinctive texture on the chalk, faceted, striated, almost combed. People working here were not feeling their way blindly through the ground. They were targeting a specific flint horizon, known today as the floorstone seam. Above and below that band lay lesser nodules, poorer quality material. The richest, largest, consistent pieces sat in this one layer, so the shafts drop to that depth and then stop. The galleries hug the seam like vines following a fence. You can see their problem-solving in the layout. Where the flint band dipped, the galleries sloped with it. Where it thinned, the miners pulled back, turning in new directions, fanning out until the seam improved again. They left chalk pillars between tunnels, narrow but sufficient, understanding by experience how much roof they could safely remove. All that flint and all that chalk had to move. Grimes Graves was a logistics project as much as a digging one. Down at the working face, someone broke the nodules free and passed them back. Others gathered them into baskets or skins, then hauled them through low passages to the foot of the shaft. From there, loads went up, probably in leather bags or woven containers, hoisted by ropes or carried up rough footholds cut into the shaft wall. Spoil chalk, too soft and bulky to keep underground, accumulated at the surface. Around each shaft, miners built up rings and mounds of discarded white rubble, forming the low rims that still define the hollows today. Somewhere near the tops of those shafts, there must have been staging areas, places where baskets were tipped out, where flint was sorted, where roughing out began. Archaeologists find just such working floors at Grimes Graves. Around some shafts, the soil is thick with broken flakes, rejected nodules, and half-formed cores. It seems likely that work pulsed seasonally. Teams might arrive during drier months, sink a new shaft or reopen an old one, work intensively for weeks, then leave as conditions changed. Generations. That rhythm carved the plough into the dense pitted landscape we see now. To sustain that effort, people needed food, water, tools, placement, antlers, timber, and coordination. The mines did not run on solitary specialists alone. Somewhere beyond the hollowed ground, fields were being tilled, herds kept, children raised. The flint that left Grimes Graves was woven into that larger cycle of farming, hunting, exchange. And yet, when you look closely at the underground spaces, it's hard to see them as merely functional holes. Some chambers are strikingly regular, their floors smoothed, their boundaries carefully shaped. In a few places, miners seem to have enlarged particular nodes beyond what was strictly needed to reach flint. In at least one famous shaft, gallery ends in what looks less like a rough tunnel, and more like an intentional, almost room-like space, where artifacts were deposited and left. Interpretations here become tentative. Some archaeologists have suggested that certain chambers may have been used for more than just extraction, perhaps as structured spaces for gatherings, for marking the end of a shaft's life, or for acts we might cautiously call ritual. Few shafts show signs that, once worked out, they were not simply abandoned as trash. Objects appear to have been placed rather than dumped. Be careful not to project too much. A smoothed floor might be the result of long use, not ceremony. A special deposit could be practical, symbolic, or both. But the pattern hints that people distinguished between different parts of the underground. Some for ordinary labour, some treated with a different kind of attention. Whatever meanings they attach to these depths, the organisation is unmistakable. Grimes Graves shows planning, but not the planning of a single blueprint drawn up in advance. Instead, reflects knowledge accreted through repetition. Each shaft draws on the experience of earlier ones. How deep to go, how to space the galleries, where to leave pillars, how to manage spoil. Young miners must have learned from older ones, being told where previous workings lay, warned about thin roofs, taught how to recognise the subtle change in chalk colour that signalled the approaching flint band. Over centuries, that shared understanding turned into something like an unwritten code of practice. The landscape became a memory store. Old shafts, half collapsed, showed where earlier generations had succeeded or failed. New shafts adjusted accordingly. The result is a worked terrain that looks, from above, almost like an engineered grid, yet was probably built one cautious decision at a time. In that sense, Grimes Graves is a textbook for how planning can emerge without drawings, without writing, and without what we would call centralised management. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of small-scale choices, guided by shared rules and stories, converge into a complex system that holds together beneath that quiet Norfolk grass. The deep shafts and radiating galleries record generations of people who understood their rock intimately, who organised their labour across seasons, who shaped their world around a resource that mattered enough to go underground for. Grimes Graves is not unique. Across the channel, in what is now Belgium, plateau of chalk and flint preserves its own network of ancient mines, linked into long-distance paths of stone, to see how far those networks could reach. We can turn to the workings at Spiennes, follow the Flint as it travels out into the wider Neolithic world. Spiennes lies on a low plateau above two small rivers, gentle rise in the landscape of southern Belgium. It does not look dramatic. Fields, hedges, a scattering of farm buildings. Beneath that quiet surface is one of the most extensive Neolithic mining districts in Europe. What makes Spiennes stand out is not just that people dug here. It is how long they kept coming back, how many different ways they opened the ground, and how widely their stone seems to have travelled. Archaeologists can trace mining at Spiennes for well over 1,000 years, perhaps closer to 2. Across that span, methods shifted. Early on, people dug open pits and shallow workings, stripping off soil and chalk to reach flint close to the surface. Later, shafts were sunk deeper, some narrow, some broad, some with carefully cut footholds down the sides. At the bottoms, low galleries radiate out, following the best seams, much as they do at Grimes Graves. From one end of the plateau to the other, you can see different phases of that story preserved in the ground. Collapsed hollows, where earlier pits once lay, clusters of deep shafts with dense spreads of working waste. Areas where the flint seems to have been tested and rejected, others where it was exploited intensely. It is not a single mine, but a whole mining landscape, used and reused by many generations, who read the chalk in slightly different ways. Turns. What turns Spiennes from a local curiosity into something larger is what happens when you look beyond the plateau. Flint from different geological sources is not identical. It has particular impurities, colours, textures, and microscopic structures. When archaeologists compare the stone from tools found on distant sites with samples from known mines, they can. In some cases, they use thin sections under a microscope. In others, chemical signatures or even trace fossil inclusions help identify the origin. Spiennes flint, when you learn to recognise it, shows up far from its source, not just in the nearby valleys, not just in the villages that ring the plateau, scattered across a wide region that stretches into what are now France, the Netherlands, and beyond. Axes, blades, rough-outs half finished and then abandoned. Artefacts that carry the same underground fingerprint. This tells us that the plateau was not simply feeding its own doorstep. It was one node in a much larger web of movement and exchange. We should be cautious about what we imagine here. It may not have been caravans in any organised sense, or traders specialising solely in flint. More likely pieces of Spiennes stone changed hands again and again, wrapped into other relationships. Gifts at marriages, exchanges between allied families, payments for livestock or grain. Part of the slow drift of objects that connects distant communities over time. What is clear is that some people at Spiennes were very good at what they did. When archaeologists map the remains of working floors, they see patterns that look like learning in progress. In some areas, the flakes are irregular, cores are overstruck, edges show clumsy attempts at shaping. Nearby, perhaps only a few metres away, the waste from another napper is remarkably consistent. Long parallel blades, edges struck at just the right angle, minimal mistakes. It is tempting to see masters and apprentices in this contrast, an older, more skilled napper working efficiently, a younger one nearby repeating the same sequences with more errors, gradually improving. Time, as people learned from one another, certain shapes became standard. Axe preforms of similar size and outline, blades struck in familiar proportions. Not because anyone enforced regulations, but because shared practice settled into tradition. There is no sign of written plans, no evidence of officials overseeing production. Yet the end result is something close to an organised industry, repeated forms, predictable quality, and an underlying knowledge of how to get from raw nodule to finished tool. The surface of the plateau records the other half of that organisation. Spoil. Heaps of chalk and broken flint accumulate around shafts, softening into low mounds. Paths wear into the ground, where people walked the same routes between workings and camps, between shafts and the nearest water. Over centuries, the repeated act of carrying stone away and bringing supplies in reshaped the landscape. What began as scattered pits gradually turned the area into a production zone. Certain patches were given over almost entirely to extraction. Others were used for primary working, roughing out axes, splitting nodules into transportable blanks. Living spaces probably shifted around the edge, close enough to support the labour, far enough to avoid the worst of the dust and debris. From above, if we could see it at its peak, the plateau might have looked like a patchwork of activity. Clusters of shafts, strings of pathways, piles of spoil, and temporary camps. From below, a honeycomb of galleries following flint bands through the chalk. All of it held together by habits, stories, and a shared sense of how things ought to be done. For some visitors today, or for those encountering the plans and diagrams in books, there can be a feeling that places like Spiennes, the depth of the shafts, the regularity of the galleries, the scale of the whole complex can seem too advanced, as if they require a central authority or technologies we do not expect in the Neolithic. But when you look closely at the evidence, the mystery softens into something more human. Spiennes did not spring up in a generation. Its complexity comes from long use. Each new shaft was dug in the knowledge of many older ones, each technique refined by teaching, trial, cautionary tales. Children grew up with the plateau as a constant presence, a place where parents and grandparents had worked, where they themselves would learn to read the rock and the tools. Community memory, carried in words and in practice, can be as powerful as any written plan. Over 1,000 years, that memory at Spiennes layered decision upon decision until the plateau held an underground architecture as intricate, in its own way, as anything later built in stone above ground. From that plateau, Flint flowed into the surrounding world, stitching together communities that might never meet face to face, and with it flowed knowledge. How to mine, how to shape, how to move heavy, sharp stones across a landscape. The urge to go underground, to bring up something valued and send it outward along paths of exchange, did not begin with metals or walled cities. By the time people were opening the chalk at Spiennes, that pattern was already well established. And in other places, people were digging too, not just for toolstone, but for something more fleeting, colour. To follow that thread, we can turn from the grey and white of flint and chalk to the reds and yellows of ochre, and to the ancient mines where people went underground in search of pigment and the means to mark the world. Core is a simple substance at first glance, iron-rich earth, clay-stained red, yellow, sometimes brown or purple, depending on how the minerals formed and weathered. If you picked it up on a walk today, it might just seem like a patch of colourful soil that stains your fingers. For a very long time, though, people treated ochre as something more than just dirt with a tint. Ground finely and mixed with fat or water, it becomes a paint. Spread on skin, lingers as body colour. Rubbed into hides, it can help preserve and soften them. Some experiments suggest it has mild antibacterial properties and can deter insects. In certain contexts, it may have helped protect skin from the sun or reduce odour on animal products. So, ochre sits at an interesting intersection of uses: practical, decorative, and possibly protective. It does not fit neatly into one category of tool or symbol. It can be all of those at once, when we look back into deep time. Long before Spiennes, long before any formal mine with shafts and galleries, traces of ochre begin to appear in archaeological layers. At sites in Africa perhaps 300,000 years old, small pieces of iron-rich pigment turn up in association with stone tools and animal bones. They are not obviously modified. They could, in theory, be natural intrusions. But as time goes on, the pattern sharpens. By around 200,000 to 160,000 years ago, we see clear signs that people were not just encountering ochre by accident. They were choosing it, processing it, and carrying it. Some pieces show grinding facets, as if they were rubbed repeatedly against a stone to produce powder. Others bear incised lines, cross-hatching or scraping that may be purely functional, helping break the surface, or might hint at an aesthetic impulse, preference for pattern even on a raw material. At Blombo's cave in South Africa, a famous example, archaeologists found ochre pieces with deliberate engravings dating to over 70,000 years ago, along with carefully made pigment. Kits, pieces of ochre, abalone shells used as containers, and grinding stones, all stored together. That kind of assemblage suggests planning. Someone anticipated future use of colour, collected ingredients, and kept them in a place where they could be returned to, again and again. Cloud. When people go to that trouble, it implies that ochre was not just used on the spot and forgotten, mattered enough to organise work and memory around it. The question then becomes, they get. In many regions, ochre can be picked up from riverbanks, eroding cliffs, or exposed patches of soil. Early uses may have been entirely opportunistic, taking what the landscape offered, the way one might collect fruit or fallen branches. Over time, though, we begin to see evidence that people were not satisfied. with whatever small scraps lay at the surface. They sought out specific sources. Some seams of ochre are purer, more intensely coloured, or more easily ground. Others contain mixtures that change the hue toward brown or dull red. Once people learned to tell the difference, they likely developed preferences. In some places, those preferences led them to dig, determining whether ancient people mined ochre in a technical sense, rather than just scraping at an outcrop. Depends on context. Archaeologists look for patterns. Pits that cut down into layers of pigment-bearing rock, tunnels, or shallow galleries following a band of coloured material. Tools associated with the extraction. At first the workings are usually small, hollow, where a better vein has been scooped out. A short trench leading into a hillside. But over thousands of years, repeated visits can turn a simple hollow into something more like a quarry. In rare cases, people pursued these seams below the surface, creating low passages where pigments could be prized from the walls under cover of rock. When that happens, ochre becomes part of the same underground story as flint, a resource worth the extra effort of digging, shaping, and transporting. Why invest so much labour in colour? Here the line between practicality and meaning blurs. We know ochre can help in hide processing, making skins more durable and easier to work. A community that relies on clothing and shelters made from hides might value red earth simply as a good working material. There is nothing mystical required. At the same time, ochre appears in contexts that are hard to explain purely in functional terms. Burials are one example. From Europe to Africa to the Near East, archaeologists have uncovered graves where the bones or the surrounding soil are stained deep red, as if powdered pigment had been sprinkled over the dead. Sometimes the colour concentrated around the head or around objects placed with the body. It would be rash to say exactly what that meant to the people involved. They did not leave texts to explain their reasoning, but it is difficult to see such persistent patterns repeated across sites and generations as accidental. Similarly, microscopic traces of ochre on tools, on grinding stones, and on fragments of shell and bone jewellery suggest it was used in body painting and in colouring ornaments. Coating skin, hair, and objects with a distinctive red or yellow could have played a role in signalling identity, marking age, status, affiliation, or readiness for a particular role. These ideas are hypotheses built from analogy with later societies that use body paint in these ways, and they should be treated as cautious possibilities rather than firm conclusions. What we can say with more confidence is that ochre moved, just as flint from Spiennes can be recognised far from its source. Certain pigment deposits have distinctive characteristics: grain size, exact shade, mineral inclusions. When these match between a distant site and a known source area, it suggests that the colour travelled. In some regions, people seem to have favoured specific hues, even when other pigments were available locally. That implies deliberate selection and perhaps a shared sense of quality or symbolism associated with a given shade. Red from one valley might carry a different reputation than red from another. Transporting pigment is easier than moving large stone tools. Post. Once ground, it can be wrapped in a bundle, sealed in a shell, or carried in a small container. Portability makes it a natural companion to other goods already passing along exchange routes. Flint blades, shell beads, shaped axes, lumps of resin. In this way, colour joined in the slow circulation of things between communities. A small packet of bright ochre could change hands as a gift, a token of alliance, a component in ritual, or a practical ingredient for hide working. Its meaning might shift at each stage, but its presence would still tie one place to another. By the time people were hewing deep flint shafts in the chalk, the urge to seek, shape and share pigment had an even longer pedigree. Going underground for colour was one more expression of a broader human tendency. To notice certain materials, to value them beyond their immediate use, and to go to extraordinary lengths to obtain them and carry them through networks of memory and exchange. Some parts of the world, that impulse would lead not just to shallow pits and quarries, but to remarkably deep tunnels dedicated entirely to ochre. To explore one of the most striking examples, we can travel in our minds to the high ground of southern Africa, and to a place where people began cutting into a hillside in search of red earth many tens of thousands of years ago. High on a ridge in what is now Eswatini, there is a scar in the hillside that doesn't look like much at first. A hollow, some broken rock, dark opening where the slope has been bitten away. This is Lion Cave. Today it is quiet. Wind moves over the grass, insects click in the heat, and the entrance sits still. But for a very long time, that opening was part of a different rhythm. People arriving, working, carrying, leaving, and then returning again, across spans of time that are hard to hold in a single thought. Geologists, studying the site, noticed something odd about the rock. The hill is made of banded ironstone, layers of iron-rich material laid down hundreds of millions of years ago. In one of those layers, the iron has weathered into a soft, reddish-brown substance, rich in hematite. Ground up, it makes a deep red pigment. When archaeologists began to examine the interior of the cave and the cuts in the hillside, the pattern became clear. This was not a natural cavity, it was a mine. The walls of Lion Cave show extraction scars, places where the pigment-bearing rock has been hacked away, leaving faceted surfaces and irregular pockets where someone followed the richest streaks. In some areas, the red layer has been removed almost entirely, leaving a roof and floor of harder rock with a hollow in between where the best material once lay. Around these hollowed spaces, there are accumulations of debris, broken fragments of ironstone, chips and dust where rock was hammered and scraped. Mixed into this are tools, stone hammers, sometimes with battered ends, and other implements suitable for prying and levering. Radiocarbon dates from associated deposits, suggests that people were working this pigment source at least as far back as the Middle Stone Age, 40,000 years ago, and continued into much later periods. Some estimates, based on the volume of material removed and the depth of the workings, suggest tens of thousands of tons of pigment could have been taken out over a full lifespan of exploitation. The exact numbers are debated, but the core point is not. This was not a one-off visit. This was repeated, persistent use. Each trip to Lion Cave would have required planning. The mineral seam is not on a major river, not at the easiest crossing point between valleys. People had to know it was there, decide it was worth the journey, organise the tools and time to extract what they needed. Then they had to leave again, carrying bundles of red earth back to wherever they lived. Why go to so much trouble for pigment? As with other ochre and hematite sites, the answer seems to lie in a blend of practical and symbolic uses. Hematite can function similarly to other iron-rich earths in hide treatment, and as a component in protective pastes, may have had uses we have not yet identified, perhaps in tanning, perhaps in preparing adhesives, perhaps in some other aspect of craft that leaves little trace. At the same time, the shade and quality of the pigment from Lion Cave are distinctive, rich, deep red, capable of producing strong colour when ground and mixed. In many cultures around the world, red becomes a privileged colour in rituals, body painting, and marking significant transitions: birth, initiation, death. We cannot simply project those meanings back in time, but the archaeological pattern around hematite suggests that vivid red was often singled out. Archaeologists, to try and interpret a place like Lion Cave, have to hold these possibilities side by side. They look at where the pigment shows up, on tools, in hearths, sometimes in burials in the broader region. They consider ethnographic parallels from groups who still use red earths in ceremonies, in healing, and in daily work. They ask, is it more plausible that people walked up to this ridge, time after time, for a purely mundane additive? Or does the intensity of effort point to something with layered significance, both useful and meaningful? The answer is almost certainly. A packet of Lion Cave pigment might have been ground into a paste for treating hides one day, smeared on skin for a rite of passage the next. The same material could move between roles without contradiction. Psst. This dual character helps explain another feature of the site: its longevity. Resources that are only marginally useful tend not to anchor human attention for very long. People exploit them when convenient and drift away when circumstances change. But where a particular material is both practically valuable and symbolically charged, it can become what some anthropologists call a focal resource, place to which memory attaches. A landmark not just in the landscape, but in the mental map of a community. Lion Cave seems to have functioned in this way. Over thousands of years, different groups, perhaps speaking different languages and following different customs, still found their way back to the same seam of red earth. Knowledge of its location and qualities had to be passed on. Taught by elders, embedded in stories, marked out in the paths that people walked. Sense, the mine is more than a hole in the rock. It is a thread of continuity, a point where generations touch the same surface, remove the same material, and carry it out into lives that must have looked very different from one era to the next. Standing at the entrance in imagination, you can trace that thread. From the first small scars where someone tested the rock, through centuries of deepening extraction, to the last visits when the old workings were already ancient. The hillside holds all of those moments together, and Lion Cave is not unique in this role. Across the world, certain quarries, salt springs, metal veins would come to serve the same function. Fixed points that drew people back again and again, shaping routes of travel, patterns of exchange, and the slow growth of shared traditions. From this red mine on an African ridge, we can turn to another such substance, just as basic and just as powerful in its quiet way. The salt hidden in rock and brine, and the underground spaces people carved to reach it. Salt seems simple. A white crystal on the tongue, a familiar sting on a cut. Something poured from a shaker without much thought. But in the long story of people and stone, salt is closer to a quiet engine. It moves animals, it draws paths through hills, pulls work into regular patterns, and turns certain patches of ground into places that people cannot easily abandon. For any human group living from hunted meat and gathered plants, salt sits in an awkward place. The body needs it. Without a steady intake, muscles falter, thinking becomes cloudy, and in time, systems begin to fail. At the same time, Many wild diets do not offer very much of it, especially far from coasts or away from naturally salty soils. Carnivores can borrow some salt from the tissues they eat, but when herds move into low-salt grazing, their bodies start to crave more. Herbivores, taking in plants that have washed and leached their minerals, need salt even more desperately. They will walk surprising distances to reach it, following faint traces of sodium in mud, water, or exposed rock. For people who keep animals, this dependence becomes a lever. Salt can mean the difference between healthy livestock and fragile ones, between animals that survive winter and animals that fail. For people who preserve food for lean seasons, salt becomes more than a flavour. It is a tool that slows decay, dries meat and fish, stretches the harvest months into winter and beyond. In cold climates, where fresh food is scarce for part of the year, salt is a way to bottle summer and autumn. In hot, landlocked regions, it protects meat from insects and heat, just long enough to carry it from one camp to another, or from one community to a trading partner days away. The need is not constant in the way that air is constant, but it is steady enough year after year that places which offer salt become anchors. Not all landscapes allow the same routes to that anchor. Along some coasts, salt can be coaxed out simply by letting seawater sit in shallow pans until sun and wind carry the water away, leaving crystals behind. In other places, underground layers of ancient sea or lake sediment lie trapped, leaking their salt slowly into springs and marshes. People can gather the briny water, pour it into simple containers, heat it with fire, scrape the forming salt from the sides. Archaeologists call the baked clay supports, basins and broken fragments from such activity brectage. On some prehistoric sites in Europe and Asia, whole fields of this fired debris have been found, low mounds made almost entirely of shattered salt-making gear. Layer upon layer of vessels used until they cracked, then tossed aside and replaced, where salt comes not as water but as stone. Thick beds of halite, rock salt, can lie under hills or plains, raised and folded over geological time. Where erosion has cut into them, people might see the glittering white seams and test them with a fingertip. Once the taste is known, there is an obvious next step: follow the seam. In a few places, this has led to the creation of deep salt mines, narrow stairways cut down into the earth, chambers opened where the salt is thickest, galleries pushed forward in low, careful steps. Tools for this work are often simple: antler picks, stone hammers, wooden wedges. But the resulting spaces can look surprisingly ordered: parallel passages, roughly regular pillars left to hold up the roof, spoil heaped in planned piles. From an archaeological distance, such patterns can be misleading. They feel modern at a glance, as though they required written plans or central authority. In practice, they may emerge almost automatically wherever people return to the same dense, brittle material under similar constraints. If a single misjudged blow can bring down a roof, then, over time, only those methods that leave enough supporting salt in place will be copied and remembered. Salt leaves its mark not only in the voids it creates, but in the scatter of life around it. At some brine springs, there are shallow pits where brackish water was collected, hearths for boiling, and dumps of briquetage spreading out like low terraces. Nearby, archaeologists often find evidence of temporary camps. Light structures, animal bones, broken tools. These can look different from ordinary settlements. People may not live there all year. Instead, They arrive with a task in mind: make salt for a season, then carry it away. At rock salt mines, there may be more substantial remains. Spoil heaps grow over decades, creating new humps in the landscape. Tracks of trampling feet and dragged loads become paths. Simple huts appear for those who stay near the entrance during a working period. Yet the main wealth generated there is not visible in the ground. It leaves as small, heavy bundles, lumps of salt, carved blocks, cakes wrapped and protected for travel. As salt production becomes more regular, society around it starts to bend. Groups that once took what they needed from natural licks may begin to specialize. Certain families or lineages might come to control access to a spring, a panfield, or a mine entrance. Others, good hunting grounds or grain fields, may trade their surplus in meat, hides, or seed for salt. Over time, networks of exchange grow more stable. Scheduled visits replace occasional ones. Promises are made about future delivery. This is one of the ways hidden economies arise. Not hidden in the sense of being secret, but in the sense of operating behind the everyday surface of foraging and farming. Someone receiving salted meat in a village far from any brine source may never see the pit where the salt was made, the corridors where it was hacked from, rock, but their diet and their season-to-season security depend on those distant routines, because demand for salt is so predictable. The work that supplies it tends toward repetition. The same pits are dug and redug. The same aphoration basins are shaped each year when the weather turns warm enough. The same mine passages are extended following the same logic of support and extraction. People learn not just how to do the job, but which times of year the water is best, when the animals will gather at nearby licks, when travel is safest. From the perspective of an archaeologist walking such a site thousands of years later, this regularity can make the place feel strangely organized, almost industrial, long before anything like a city appears nearby. There are zones for production, areas where waste accumulates, paths that link working spaces to living spaces and to routes outward. And yet, in most of these early examples, we are still in a world of small communities. The coordination does not require palaces or writing. It is carried instead in habits, stored in stories about when to go, how to dig, where not to strike. The mine plan exists in the memories of people who have grown up watching older hands work. From pigment ridges like Lion Cave to saline springs and pale tunnels of rock salt, a pattern emerges. Certain substances pull people back again and again. They ask for patience, for scheduled effort, for trust that what is extracted now can be stored and shared later. In those quiet necessities, the outlines of more complex economies begin to show, even while the broader landscape still looks wild. From here we can widen our view beyond flint and salt to other kinds of stone that drew similar attention. Hard, tough rocks for axes and grinding tools, quarried in places that would grow into their own quiet centres of movement and exchange. By the time farming communities were spreading across parts of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, people were no longer satisfied with sharp edges alone. Flint blades and scrapers could cut and slice, but clearing fields, shaping timbers, and hollowing out canoes demanded something else. Tools that could take repeated blows without shattering, tools that could be sharpened again and again into a smooth, durable curve. This is where a different family of stones enters the story. Fine-grained igneous rocks, dense metamorphic stones, tough, greenish rocks that fracture in rounded, predictable ways. Archaeologists give them technical names: dolerite, basalt, hornfels, jadite, nephrite. But to the people who sought them, important qualities would have been more immediate. Some rocks could be ground to a silky finish that slid cleanly through wood. Some could hold a gleaming, polished edge that seemed to drink in light. Some simply felt right in the hand, heavy, cool, quiet. Unlike flint, which can sometimes be gathered from riverbeds or eroding cliffs, these axe stones often lie in specific bands or lenses of rock. They do not scatter themselves across the landscape in handy nodules. To use them, people had to go to their sources, and the sources were often inconvenient. High ridges, remote hills, hidden stripes of stone, sandwiched between less useful layers, quarries grew where those seams came close enough to reach. In some places the work began in the open, shallow pits following a vein of promising stone along a hillside. Workers might undercut the seam, chiselling from below, or drive short adits into the slope, pursuing the best material inward. At certain sites, those adits become short tunnels, barely high enough to crawl through, branching cautiously as the seam twists and thickens. Down there, under a few metres of soil and rock, the activity was focused. The goal was not to produce finished axes in the dark, but to free usable chunks from the living rock and rough them into portable forms. Archaeologists find what are called rough outs or blanks, elongated, leaf-shaped pieces, already narrowed and thickened roughly into the shape of an axe, but still far from polished. Final shaping and grinding would happen elsewhere, closer to water, sand, and home. This on-site roughing out makes practical sense. Good axe stone is dense and heavy. Transporting it in raw blocks would have been slow and wasteful. By trimming away the worst flaws underground or at the quarry face, miners turned dozens of kilos of rock into a smaller number of promising cores, blanks. The waste remained where it fell, building fans of broken stone at tunnel mouths and along quarry walls, geological equivalent of sawdust. When archaeologists map the distribution of polished stone axes across Neolithic landscapes, quiet pattern emerges. The same narrow types of rock, the same microscopic crystal textures reappear again and again in villages, many days' walk from any known outcrop. With thin sections under a microscope, or with chemical fingerprinting, it becomes possible to link a finished axe back to a very particular quarry or mine. In some regions, this linking reveals astonishing reach. Stone from a mountain ridge might show up hundreds of kilometres away. In lowland settlements that had no local access to such material. In Britain, for example, axes made from a distinctive greenish stone in the Langdale Fells of the Lake District have been found scattered across much of the island. In parts of continental Europe, high-quality alpine jadeite appears far to the north and west. In areas that never had such rock underfoot, these were not casual souvenirs. To carry an axe that had begun as a chunk of stone in some distant hill was to carry a story. It testified that someone, somewhere, had travelled to that source or knew someone who had. It implied chains of acquaintance, marriage links, trading partners. An axe could move from hand to hand over decades, long after the original miner and polisher were gone. Because of this, polished axes and adzes may have carried meanings beyond their immediate use. They certainly cleared trees, shaped beams, and helped build the wooden architecture of early farming life. Evidence of edge, wear and resharpening confirms that many were working tools, not ornaments. Yet some examples are oversized, too large for comfortable use, or show little trace of practical wear. Others are carefully placed in graves, in pits, or in bogs, as if offered up rather than discarded. It is reasonable to think that, in many communities, a fine axe might be both tool and symbol. Giving such an object as a gift could seal an alliance, mark the resolution of a dispute, or acknowledge a marriage tie. Lending one might carry obligations of return and reciprocity. Household that owned several high-quality axes from distant stone might be seen differently from one that did not, even if both grew the same crops. In this way, the mines and quarries that supplied axe stone became quietly entangled with social life. They were not just holes in the ground, they were sources of valued objects that could travel further than most people ever did. Visiting a quarry might be more than a work trip. It could be a chance to meet others who came for the same stone, to share news, to arrange future exchanges. Over time, extraction and craft began to shape each other. As miners became familiar with their seams, they learned which layers produced stone best suited to certain kinds of tools. A fine, even-grained band might be ideal for long, narrow blades. Tougher, slightly coarser layer might yield thicker, impact-resistant axes. Knowledge flowed both ways. Toolmakers, working at grinding stones by streams and lakes, discovered which blanks survived polishing, which edges chipped, colours their neighbours admired. When a particular kind of axe proved especially durable or especially pleasing, demand for that stone rose. People would be more willing to walk a little farther, climb a little higher, or dig a little deeper. In response, quarry workers focused their efforts, following the richest part of the seam, cutting adits where surface sources had been exhausted, and discarding substandard rock more ruthlessly. The workshops, in turn, adapted to the sizes and shapes the mines could most easily supply. What emerges from this is a slow feedback loop. The ground offers certain possibilities. Human hands test them, refine them, favour some over others. Preferences take hold. They guide further digging, which, in turn, guides further craft. No single person plans the system, yet over generations, mines feed workshops. Workshops create desire for specific textures and colours, and the landscape of extraction grows more defined. To a drowsy mind tracing these patterns in the dark, the world of the Neolithic begins to look less like a patchwork of isolated villages and more like a web. At one node, a quarry cut into a windy hillside, its floors strewn with broken cores. At another, riverside grinding place where people sit for hours, turning rough stone into a mirror-smooth edge. Between them, paths, stories, bargains, quiet understandings, and, in the background, always, the land itself, offering flint, salt, pigment, axe stone to those willing to go beneath the surface, to pry and chip and carry. As we move forward in time, other substances will enter that bargain. Veins of metal hidden inside rock, inviting new tools, new risks, and new ways of thinking about what lies underfoot. When metal enters the story, it does so quietly. Long before anyone built a furnace, people were picking up strange, heavy nodules from riverbeds and exposed hillsides. Some of these were just unusually dense stones. A few were different. They had a reddish skin where they'd weathered in the air, or a green bloom where they'd reacted with water. Strike them, and they did not fracture like flint. Hammer them, and they flattened instead of shattering. Native copper, metal that occurs in metallic form, not locked away in complex ores. In several parts of the world, people seem to have found such pieces and treated them almost as a new type of stone. They could be cold-hammered into beads, hooks, small awls. Archaeologists find these earliest copper objects still bearing the structure of hammered metal, not yet melted and cast. The copper was bent and compressed, not poured. No mines were yet required. Surface finds and shallow pits were enough. This stage is important because it shows that the first encounter with copper was tactile. People learned that it was workable, that it flowed under repeated blows. In a way, stone never did. It could be straightened after bending, could be thinned, without splitting along a hidden fracture line. That must have felt uncanny at some point. At different times in different regions, someone pushed this strange material into the fire. This might have been accidental, a piece of native copper dropped into a hearth. A copper-stained stone that happened to lie under the hottest coals. Or it might have been deliberate, part of the endless, low-level experimentation that people carried out with pigments, clays and minerals. However it began, there came a night when someone raked back ash and charcoal and saw that the stone had changed. The greenish crust on a lump of malachite had slipped, sagged, or beaded into something softer and redder beneath. Smelting is, in essence, controlled burning. Copper does not simply drip out of any copper-coloured rock you heat. The ore must be chosen carefully, the temperature brought high enough, and held, there the airflow tuned, so that oxygen is low enough to strip metal from its mineral bonds, but not so low that the fire dies. This is where copper extraction diverges sharply from the earlier mining you've heard about. Flint and axe stone could be won with impact and leverage. You hit, wedged, burned, or soaked the rock until it cracked along its own weaknesses. The quarry was the workshop. With copper, the mine and the workshop began to separate. The mine's job was to supply ore, not finished shapes. Between rock and tool, a new space opened up. The smelting place. Archaeologists recognize these spaces by their scars. Slag. The glassy, vesicular waste left after metal has been smelted from ore. Furnaces or furnace bases. Low structures built of clay and stone, sometimes with clay tuyere. Nozzles through which air was blown or drawn. Roasting pits, where ore was first heated in open fires to drive off moisture and some impurities, turning bright green or blue stones into brittle, easier to smelt fragments. Sorting floors strewn with crushed rock where people had sat and separated, promising ore from useless gang. These traces are often more durable than the metal itself. Copper can be recycled endlessly. People in the past seem to have been as reluctant to discard it as we might expect. But slag heaps do not melt back into ore. Broken furnace linings do not reassemble. You can walk across a hillside today and see, under a light covering of soil, dull mounds of old slag, where a community once made the ground hot enough to glow. Working like this carried new risks. A flint worker might cut a hand or get an eye full of shards. A stone miner might be crushed by a falling block or choked by dust. A metal worker dealt with all of that, plus the hazards of fumes and fire. Copper ores can carry arsenic and other elements. Roasting and smelting them releases vapours that, in a still valley or a closed structure, can sicken or kill. There is no reason to think early smelters understood the chemistry in our terms, but they would have noticed patterns, certain ores that made people cough, certain winds that were better for firing, certain tasks that were best done quickly and then left alone. Heat had to be coaxed and contained. Too little and the ore softened but no metal separated. Too much, furnace walls slumped, or the charcoal burned away before the reaction finished. In many early copper-working regions, you can see the fingerprints of trial and error. Furnaces rebuilt with thicker walls. Tuyere angles changed. Alternate layers of ore and charcoal arranged more carefully over time. The first metallurgists were, in a very real sense, doing science with their lives on the line. Around these furnaces, labour had to be organised in new ways. Someone had to mine or gather the ore, whether from surface scatters, shallow trenches, or, eventually, from narrow shafts following a promising vein. Someone else had to bring fuel, wood cut, dried, and converted into charcoal in separate pits or clamps. Charcoal is lighter than raw wood but still bulky. Supplying a smelting site meant many back-and-forth journeys with heavy loads. On firing days there would have been sequences of tasks. Ore crushers breaking rock to the right size. Sorters discarding pieces that did not show the right colours or densities. Fire tenders feeding charcoal, adjusting vents, maybe working bellows. Metalworkers watching for the subtle signs that slag and metal were ready to separate. In many places, this does not look like a factory in our sense, but it is no longer a casual sideline either. The rhythm of a community had to bend a little around the needs of the furnaces. None of this happened everywhere at once, or is in the same way. In Southwest Asia, sort of early copper working appears thousands of years before. Similar practices are visible in much of Europe, parts of the Balkans and the Carpathian region. Surprisingly early experiments in both native copper and smelting hint at local innovations that rose and fell. In other areas, communities used copper ornamentally for long stretches before trying to make tools from it, or went directly from occasional native copper use to more complex bronze alloys without a long, pure copper phase. Archaeology is filling in this mosaic, but it remains a mosaic. There is no single moment when humans discovered copper, and no simple ladder from stone to copper to bronze that every region climbed in the same order. Local ores mattered, so did existing traditions of quarrying, craft, and exchange. What we can say is that wherever copper working took hold, changed how people thought about the ground beneath them. Stone was no longer just something to be cut and carried. It became a container for something hidden, something that required heat, air, and knowledge to release a host. Mines were no longer simply places where tool shapes were freed from their matrix. They became the upstream end of a chain of transformations, leading through fire to new colours, new textures, and new possibilities. As that chain lengthened, some places dug deeper. The desire for ore drew shafts further underground, into forms that, at first glance, can look disturbingly modern. Twisting galleries, ventilation holes, stacked stopes. To understand them, we need to follow copper from these first furnaces into one of the most ambitious Bronze Age mining landscapes in Europe, where the rock above a shallow bay would be honeycombed by generations of miners working mostly by fire, stone, patience. On the north coast of Wales, a headland called the Great Orme rises out of the sea. From a distance it looks peaceful. Grassy slopes, limestone cliffs, a place for sheep and seabirds. But beneath that calm surface lies one of the most intricate Bronze Age mining systems known in Europe. Miles of passages cut into the rock spread over multiple levels, converging and diverging in ways that, on a plan, can look unnervingly like a modern underground mine. For a long time, those patterns fueled speculation. How could primitive people, with no iron, no explosives, no engines, have cut such an elaborate maze? The answer, when you walk the tunnels in your mind and slow them down to human time, is that the Great Orme is remarkable, not because it breaks the rules of ancient mining, but because it shows exactly what those rules can achieve if you apply them patiently for centuries. The miners there were after copper ores running through the limestone in veins and pockets. They did not simply drive straight tunnels and hope for the best. They followed the ore. Imagine a small group starting at an outcrop where green-stained rock breaks the surface. They hammer at it, first in the open, then in shallow pits. As they remove the easy ore, they see that the richest material continues inward. So they widen a crack, crawl into it, and keep going. Every time the ore bends, the passage bends. When it splits, the tunnel splits. When it pinches out, the miners back up to the last good section and try a different direction. Do this once, and you get a crooked hole. Do it again and again, generations, and you get something much more complex. Overlapping levels, narrow steps, rising above and dropping below, side galleries that end in exhausted pockets. The geometry of the mine is simply the geometry of the ore, traced out by human bodies over a very long time. The tools were simple, but not crude. Archaeologists at Great Orme have found thousands of stone hammers, rounded cobbles, often with shallow grooves pecked in them so they could be held more securely, or hafted with withies. These were swung again and again against the rock, bruising it, exploiting tiny weaknesses left by earlier heating or natural fractures. Many are worn almost smooth, their working ends flattened and polished by use. Fire setting was used as well. Miners would stack wood against the face, light it, and let the heat soak into the rock. Hot stone expands. When it cools, especially if splashed or exposed quickly to cooler air, microcracks form. In limestone and ore veins, this process makes the rock more friable after the fire burned down and the smoke cleared. Hammerstones and antler picks could break away material that would have been almost impossible to catch cold. The spaces they made could be brutally tight. Some tunnels at Great Orme narrow to the width of a child's shoulders, roof so low an adult would have to lie flat to pass. That is not mysterious engineering, it is efficiency. Rock is heavy, waste rock has to be moved somewhere. If the ore body itself is no wider than a human body, there is no need to enlarge it to comfortable adult proportions when a smaller child can wriggle through and work where the adults cannot. In those close spaces light was precious. No electric lamps, no pressurized gas, just small smoky flames, tallow candles, simple grease lamps, perhaps slivers of resinous wood. A pale, localized glow, enough to see the difference between green ore and pale host rock, enough to keep from losing track of the way out. The ceilings and walls still bear the soot of those flames, thin black skins layered over the hammer scars. Between the working faces and the daylight, there were constant movements of broken rock. Waste was dumped in older, played-out chambers, or dragged to the surface, and heaped into tips that slowly reshaped the slopes above, or went the other way, outwards, carried in baskets or skin bags, each load small enough for one person to manage, together, adding up to astonishing volumes over time. As they worked, the miners were not only removing rock, they were accumulating knowledge. They learned by touch and colour which shades of green and blue promised richer copper. They learned to read the subtle cues of the rock, the way a vein might thin before, thickening again. The little change in texture that hinted at a nearby pocket. They learned when fire setting helped, and when it only wasted fuel, when a crack was safe to push, and when it signalled a dangerous loose block. Much of this would never be spoken in full sentences. It would be shown. A hand on a stone, a gesture, a brief instruction in the glow of a lamp. From outside, centuries later, it can be tempting to leap to extraordinary explanations, to look at the complexity of the Great Orme's tunnels and say that such a thing shouldn't exist without advanced technology. But underground, the logic is straightforward. You have a resource that your society values. Copper for tools, weapons, ornaments, exchange. You have methods that work. Hammering, fire setting, careful observation of the ore. You have people willing to spend long hours in the dark in exchange for what that metal brings. Put those together, not for a single lifetime, but for many, and the result is inevitable. The mine grows outward and downward, one niche, one stope, one crawl space at a time, until the headland is riddled. What looks impossibly intricate at the scale of a map becomes completely ordinary at the scale of a single worker and a single lamp. A few feet of new passage, a pile of fresh rock, another basket of ore hauled to the surface. Persistence stands in for power tools. When you see the Great Orme this way, it stops being an anomaly and starts being a kind of baseline. It shows what Bronze Age communities could achieve with standard techniques, sustained effort, and a compelling reason to keep going deeper. Which makes the next question sharper, not softer. This is what is possible with simple means. Why do some underground structures still feel as though they do not quite fit? Part of the answer lies in our own expectations. When we look at a map of an ancient mine, we are not seeing rock and sweat and darkness. We are seeing lines on paper. Straight passages. Neat forks, curving loops that almost look like someone's design for a subway or a drainage system. Brains are very good at spotting patterns, especially modern ones. We spend our lives in buildings made to right angles, streets laid out in grids, inside systems planned from above. So when we see something underground that even faintly resembles that kind of order, we instinctively reach for a story that matches it. This must have been planned, top-down by a mastermind, maybe even by people with knowledge beyond their time. But underground, the logic is often bottom-up. Imagine again those Bronze Age or Neolithic miners. They do not begin with a blueprint. They begin with a spot of ore, a patch of coloured rock, a salty spring, a band of softer chalk. From there, they follow a few simple rules that almost any human group will discover quickly if they work. Stone for long enough. Rule 1. Stay with the good material. If the vein runs straight, you run straight. If it bends, you bend. If it branches, choose a branch. On a map that looks like a deliberate corridor with side passages. In practice, it is just stubbornly chasing the richest streak. Rule 2. Keep the roof up. People who live with rock learn very fast what a dangerous crack looks like, what a hollow sound means when you tap the ceiling, how thick a pillar needs to be to feel trustworthy. They leave supporting ribs of stone where they must, widen where they can, narrow where they have to. Over time, these choices generate patterns. Regularish pillars, repeating chamber shapes, even something that looks like a grid when viewed from far above. But nobody had to plan a grid. They only had to want to come home alive. Rule 3. A layout works, repeat it. Once a community discovers that a certain way of arranging passages and shafts keeps air moving, keeps water draining, or makes it easier to move ore out and waste back, that arrangement gets copied. Not because someone is drafting diagrams, because the old miners teach the young ones, and the young ones are practical. Do it like we did over there. That worked. Over generations, the mine begins to echo itself. New galleries resemble older ones. Familiar angles reappear. Standard solutions crystallize into what, from a distance, looks like deliberate engineering. This is one of the deep tricks of human history. Simple rules repeated patiently can create structures that feel far more designed than they really are. There is another layer, too, that distorts our sense of what is possible. Time. When you and I look at a complicated tunnel network, our minds compress it all into a single moment. One finished system, one achievement, one mystery. But the rock does not remember it that way. Rock felt every hammer blow separately. A tight crawl cut in 1800 BCE might connect to a chamber. Opened 500 years later, which in turn links to an access shaft, sunk near the end of the mine's life. To the people who dug each part, the mine was smaller, simpler. They only ever knew a fragment. They did not see the aerial plan we see, with its branching limbs and interlocking levels. That total picture only exists now in our maps and diagrams, stitched together from surveys, excavations, and reconstructions. So a structure that feels impossibly sophisticated for a single ancient project is often not a single project at all. It is a palimpsest of decisions, revisions, collapses and reopenings, layered over centuries or millennia until they read, in our compressed hindsight, like the work of a single grand design. Because of that feeling, some people step from reasonable awe into more speculative territory. You can find claims that certain mines or tunnels must reflect lost sciences, unknown machines or civilizations that left no other trace. It is understandable. When we are surprised, our minds search for explanations that match the intensity of that surprise. If the structure feels modern, the builder must have been modern in some hidden way. Archaeologists, though, are trained to separate that feeling from the evidence. They look for tool marks. Are the walls scarred by stone hammers, antler picks, metal chisels, or something else? They examine debris. Are there flakes, broken tools, charcoal from fire setting, lumps of slag from smelting? They date the layers with whatever methods are available. Radiocarbon from old wood, stratigraphy of backfill, styles of pottery in associated levels, isotopic analysis of the ore itself as it appears in artifacts elsewhere. When extraordinary technology is proposed, lines of evidence should show something equally extraordinary. Unusual materials, residues that don't match known techniques, objects that clearly do not fit the chronology suggested by the rest of the site. In well-studied prehistoric mines, places like Spiennes, Grimes Graves, Lion Cave, or Great Orme, what we actually find are consistent signatures of stone, bone, antler, early metal, and human labour. Nothing that obliges us to invoke machines or knowledge out of their time. That does not make these places less impressive. If anything, makes them more so. Because then the straightness of a passage is not the work of a laser, but of someone carefully sighting along a lamplight shadow. The repeating chambers are not the output of a drafting table, but the memory of what felt safe in the dark. The sprawling network is not a single act of genius, but the accumulation of thousands of cautious, practical decisions, each made with limited information, and a strong wish to see daylight again, holding both sides together. Our sense of wonder and our commitment to evidence is its own kind of discipline. You can let the mines astonish you. You can lie there, in the quiet and picture the flicker of flames on wet stone, the muffled thud of hammers, the murmur of voices far below the surface. You can feel in your imagination the strangeness of walking through a labyrinth dug long before cities rose. And at the same time, you can remember that what built those spaces was not hidden technology or unknown beings, but ordinary humans. People with bodies like ours, minds like ours, the same mix of caution and curiosity, fear and persistence. People who learned simple rules followed them patiently, but behind. In doing so, underground worlds that still have the power to unsettle us. Once you see that, another question emerges, softer but deeper. If these minds show us what determined communities can carve from the dark, what do they tell us about why our ancestors went underground in the first place? What drew them, generation after generation, into those narrow spaces where the air is thin and the light is uncertain? Part of the answer is simple, and it begins with survival. If you live in a world without metal, without plastic, without factories, stone is not optional. It is edge and leverage and distance. A sharp flint blade turns a carcass into food before it spoils. A durable axe opens wood, shapes shelters, breaks bone for marrow. Carefully formed point on the end of a spear extends your reach beyond your arm's length, lets you strike an animal that could kill you if it came too close. The people who cut those tunnels into chalk and limestone were not collecting curiosities. They were hunting for reliability. The good flint, the predictable flint, the kind that fractures in the right way and holds an edge, is not scattered everywhere. It often sits in specific layers, at specific depths. Reaching it means going down. The same is true of salt, without refrigeration. Salt is preservation, seasoning, and survival chemistry, all at once. It keeps meat edible, balances diets heavy in grains, replaces what sweat takes away. Communities close to briny springs or rock salt deposits are sitting on something as vital as water itself. Digging, boiling, scraping, however you get at it, is not an experiment. It is maintenance of life. Even pigments like ochre, first glance more decorative than essential, can serve practical ends. Used on skins to help soften and preserve them. Earth mixed with fat as a kind of sunscreen or insect deterrent, used to mark tools or bodies in ways that carry information. So the first motive underground is clear enough. Tools, food, hunting, gear, materials that keep decay a little farther away. Humans rarely stop at enough. When archaeologists see mines or quarries that were not just visited once, but returned to over and over for centuries, sometimes millennia, another layer of questions appears. Why here, not the slightly worse Flint, only a little farther away? Why continue to reopen the same shafts when other sources exist, possible? Though hard to prove, that some of these places took on meanings beyond their material yield. Repeated pathways into the earth, familiar chambers, the same striking seam of red or black or glittering rock. All of that invites story. Narrow entrance that your grandparents used becomes, in time, a place where our people have always gone. The vein itself, emerging out of the dark like a hidden river, can be felt as a gift or a boundary. Certain pockets of ochre or crystal might be set aside, not for scraping hides or cutting meat, but for burials, body painting, or marking special objects. Not necessarily with elaborate ceremonies in the modern sense, with patterned behaviour that folds meaning into matter. A mine mouth, where offerings are left, particular shaft used whenever someone important dies. The same pigment chosen for both hunting gear and the lines painted on a dancer's skin. We cannot hear their words, but we can see the hints in the archaeology. Deposits that seem deliberate, tools left behind in positions that look more like placing than dropping. Pockets of pigment far richer than practicality strictly requires. Then there is trade. High-quality flint from places like Spiennes or Grimes Graves doesn't just show up at the mine. It appears, shaped and reshaped, far away, carried along paths that connect communities who may never meet face to face. Salt blocks move from uplands to lowlands. Copper from one mountain range turns up as an axe on a distant shore. In such worlds, scarcity and quality become a kind of currency. If your group controls access to a particularly fine seam of flint, or a dependable salt spring, you do not just have tools, you have leverage. You can trade blades for hides, salt for grain, pigment for favours. The mine becomes more than a hole in the ground. It becomes the root of relationships, obligations, reputations. Status can crystallise around this. Skilled miners, successful organisers of labour, people who know the safest tunnels or the best pockets of ore. These individuals hold knowledge that others rely on. Their expertise is social capital. The ability to give or withhold access to underground wealth may help define leaders, allies, and outsiders. And always there is the work itself. Mining is dangerous. It requires cooperation. Someone has to swing the hammer. Someone has to hold the lamp. Someone has to haul the baskets of stone or salt back to the surface. In narrow chambers, you depend completely on the others in your group. Careless blow, a dropped load, a missed crack in the ceiling can mean collapse, injury, or death. Shared risk is a powerful binding agent. The stories told around fires afterward. About that time the roof groaned and held, about the first glimpse of a new vein, about the ancestor who was buried when the chamber fell in. Tie people together as strongly as any trade agreement. Over time, the mine itself can become part of a group's identity. This is our place, our danger, our wealth. Children grow up hearing those stories, learning to recognise the smell of damp stone, the taste of salt in the air, the feel of chalk dust on their skin. When they are finally old enough to descend, they are not just learning a technique. They are stepping into a role, joining a chain of memory that stretches back through generations. Seen this way, early mining is not simply a practical response to material needs, and not simply an early industry. It is a bridge. On one side lies the hard arithmetic of survival: calories, seasons, sharp edges, stored meat, safe water. On the other lies the human tendency to turn repeated actions into pattern, pattern into meaning, and meaning into culture. Rituals, stories, identities, and social bonds. The tunnels and chambers our ancestors carved are where those two currents meet. Pick marks on the walls are about getting enough stone today. The path you take to reach them, the songs you sing as you work, the stories you tell about who first opened the vein, those are about who you are and how you belong. When we walk modern eyes through those spaces, following survey maps and floor plans, we are moving across the fossilized remains of both needs at once. The hunger for tools, salt, pigment, metal, quieter, deeper hunger to weave those things into a shared life that feels coherent, meaningful, and worth the risks of going down into the dark. In the end, that may be the most striking thing these ancient mines reveal. Not that our ancestors could dig so far or plan so cleverly, but that, even in the most practical corners of their world, they were already doing what humans do best. Turning work into story, danger into bond, bare necessity, into the first threads of culture that would one day rise far above them as cities on the surface, when people say these tunnels shouldn't exist. What they often mean is that they feel too deliberate, too extensive, too organised for the distant past we carry in our heads. But if we listen carefully to the evidence, a quieter picture emerges. The mines and galleries at places like Grimes Graves, Spiennes, Lion Cave, Hallstatt, the Great Orme. None of them show impossible technology, no mysterious alloys we cannot reproduce, no perfect laser cuts, no concrete proof of lost machines humming in the dark. What we do see, over and over, is something both simpler and more impressive. We see thousands of blows from stone hammers, patient and repetitive, deer antler picks worn down to the base, fires kindled to crack stubborn rock, piles of waste carefully heaped in side chambers, shafts sunk, abandoned, then reopened generations later along the same rich seam. We see planning, ventilation shafts, drainage, the choice to follow one vein and ignore another. We see standardization in tools and in the shapes of the shafts themselves, suggesting that knowledge was taught, remembered, improved. We see long-distance movement of flint, salt, ochre, copper, that traces the outline of trade, obligation and alliance across entire regions. What these mines really challenge is not physics or engineering. They challenge our tendency to underestimate how much time deep time actually offers and how much focused effort small communities can pour into the ground when their lives, stories and identities depend on what they pull out, given hundreds or thousands of years, given steady hands and shared memory. Families and villages can carve labyrinths. So, when you picture those ancient tunnels now, you don't need to imagine hidden civilizations with inexplicable tools. You can imagine something at once humbler and more astonishing. People a bit shorter, a bit stronger in the arm, but with minds entirely familiar to us. Careful, anxious, hopeful, descending together into the dark. They carry picks and baskets. They carry songs and stories. They carry each other's weight. They go down because salt keeps their children alive through winter, because good flint means a cleaner kill, less suffering for both hunter and hunted, because a streak of red ochre on skin or stone means belonging, and then, at the end of each day, they come back up, out of the chalk dust, out of the cool silence, back into the wind, the light, the smoke of evening fires, back to a surface that in time will grow fields, roads, villages, and eventually cities over the hollows their hands have made. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you're lying on the farthest tip of that story, somewhere under the modern noise and pavement, under farmland and forests. Old tunnels are still there, empty now, except for echoes and the slow settling of stone. They do not prove that someone impossible was here before us. They remind us that we have been here, as humans, for a very long time. Long enough to learn the grain of rock, to follow thin seams through darkness, to cooperate in cramped spaces, to endure danger for the sake of those waiting above. Long enough to turn even a pit in the ground into a place of skill, memory, and meaning, if this quiet journey underground has helped you rest, or given you something gentle to think about as you fall asleep. You're welcome to stay with this channel. If you'd like, you can softly tap like, subscribe, so that more slow stories of deep time and quiet mysteries can find their way to you. And if you're still awake enough to type a few words, you're invited to leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. A city, a coastline, a valley, a small room somewhere above your own layers of rock. It's a way of lighting a tiny signal on the surface. A reminder that, scattered across the planet under different skies, we are still part of the same long human network that once carried flint, salt, and stories out of the dark.